Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now we begin. Story 1. A day in the life of a 13th century English family. The world you're entering is damp. It smells of wood smoke and earth. The air inside the home is thick, still heavy from the fire kept smoldering overnight. It's sometime before sunrise. This is not a castle, nor a monastery. It is a modest, single-room timber and wattle house in the English countryside in the year 1253. The family that lives here is not noble, not even well off. They are peasants. Villeins, to be precise, bound to the land but allowed a small holding to cultivate. The man of the house, Hugh, rises first. There's no bed in the way we think of it, just rough straw on the floor, matted and flattened under shared blankets. His joints ache, a result of years bent in fields. His first job is not to eat or dress, it is to stoke the fire. Without a fire there will be no breakfast, and in this season no warmth. He pushes the old ash aside and finds a few glowing embers. These he feeds with dry brush and a log reserved the night before. Sparks rise lazily, painting the low rafters with orange light. There is no chimney, just a smoke hole in the roof. Soot coats everything. The thatch above drips tarry black drops when it rains. You might expect prayers next, or perhaps a meal, but the next task is often bodily. He relieves himself outside, in the shared midden trench behind the house. There's no privacy. The latrine is communal, dug by several neighboring families, and the smell is simply part of life. The children, 3 of them, all under 10, are still asleep. Their mother, Edith, stirs when she hears Hugh's footsteps. She begins preparing pottage, the daily staple. Oats, water, and whatever scraps remain. Perhaps a few wild onions, yesterday's cabbage, or even a slice of salted pork if the family was lucky. This morning it is oats and nettles only. Edith's role is central, though rarely noted in surviving documents. She manages the rhythm of the house, what must be washed, what must be dried, what debts must be remembered. Her hands are cracked from lye soap and scrubbing linen in cold water. By now the light outside is shifting to gray. The rooster crows. Other sounds drift into the walls. The smith's bellows, a cow lowing, the distant clang of the mill wheel. Today, like most days, Hugh will spend it in the Lord's fields. As a villein, he owes labor a few days per week working the domain lands. Only afterward can he tend to his own plot. That means fewer hours to grow food for his own family. The margins are always thin. The children wake with little fanfare. They are dressed in hand-me-down wool, many times patched. The oldest, Alice, helps stir the pottage, careful not to let the iron pot tip over the firestone circle. The youngest whines for a crust of yesterday's bread, coarse and dark, heavy with barley and sometimes bits of grit from the millstone. The family eats silently. Speaking isn't forbidden, it's simply unnecessary. Energy is precious, so is warmth. After the meal, chores begin. Edith will fetch water from the communal well, a task that sounds simple but demands strength and balance. The wooden bucket is heavy even when empty. When full, it's back-breaking. Yet this water must last through the morning for cleaning, boiling, perhaps even drinking if ale cannot be brewed that day. The village is not lawless nor free. It is part of a manor ruled by a lord who lives miles away, but his steward visits regularly. Tithes must be paid, usually in crops or eggs or labor. There's a record of who owes what, scratched on a wax tablet or parchment. Mistakes are punished. Mercy is rare. Still, life here is not only hardship. There is order too, a rhythm of expectation. The tasks repeat daily, weekly, with slight changes in winter and harvest times, and through this repetition the family survives. Mid-morning, Edith sets out with Alice to gather herbs from the hedgerows. Mugwort, yarrow, and plantain grow near the boundary ditch. Some will be dried, others boiled into salves for wounds. Folk medicine, passed down through generations of women. Back at home, Hugh returns early, muddy, silent. The steward did not arrive, so work was paused. This is rare, and it means an unexpected afternoon for tending their own field. Potatoes do not yet exist in this world. Instead, they grow beans, barley, and perhaps leeks. Carrots, but not orange, purple, and pale varieties. They speak little, but as they work side by side in the plot behind their house, there is something close to peace. Inside the house, the fire has burned low again. Alice adds another log. The light fades. The day ends as it began, in smoke and silence. But what happens in the long, dark hours between dusk and dawn, when the family retreats from work but cannot afford candles or oil lamps? How did they spend those hours, and what fears crept into a house lit only by firelight? As twilight folds over the village like a blanket, the temperature falls rapidly. With the sun gone, warmth is no longer a given. You may imagine the medieval countryside as tranquil, almost romantic under the stars, but in reality, the night brought discomfort, uncertainty, and sometimes fear. Inside the peasant's home, the fire becomes the center of existence. Its low orange glow doesn't offer much light, but it gives something more essential: comfort. Without it, the room would be almost completely dark. The walls are built of timber and wattle, packed with mud and dung to keep the wind out. But that insulation is only marginally effective. The floor is packed earth, sometimes swept, sometimes not. Rats and mice live here too, and they make their presence known at night. In winter, livestock might even be brought indoors: pigs or a chicken or two, not from affection, but because their warmth helps. The family settles in for the evening. There is no concept of leisure as we know it. The hours after sunset are often devoted to quiet, repetitive tasks: repairing tools, spinning wool, darning clothes. Edith takes up a drop spindle, teasing wool from a tuft into a thin, continuous thread. This slow work provides the yarn that she will later weave or trade. Young Alice picks burrs from a basket of combed fleece. It's itchy, tedious work, but necessary. Even children have their place in the economic rhythm of the household. Hugh works on a broken handle for a hoe. He uses a small knife and a piece of ash wood, seasoned but still green enough to carve. Tools are expensive. Repairing is essential. They speak little, but not from coldness. The stillness of the evening is heavy and slow, like the thick wool cloaks they wrap around their shoulders. This is not a time for stories or play, not every night. Some nights pass in silence, others in small conversations about crops, obligations, neighbors, and debts. In the corner of the home, a small clay oil lamp might be lit if they are lucky to have any rendered animal fat left. The light is weak, flickering, and smoky. Most families save this meager light for winter. Occasionally you might hear singing. Low, rhythmic. It's not performance, it's habit. A lullaby for the children or a work song from Edith as she spins. But what of the mind? Even among people busy with survival, thoughts wander. The church is ever present in the medieval imagination. Daily life is steeped in religion, not just prayer, but fear of sin, of punishment, of hell. The family says a prayer together before sleep, usually in Latin, though the children understand only fragments. In these moments, the darkness feels full of ideas, of spirits, of things unseen. Folk beliefs linger beneath Christian rituals. People speak in whispers about the night air, about spirits that might slip through the walls. It's not that they believe in ghosts, it's that they can't afford not to. Outside, the sounds of the night intensify. Wolves are rare by the 13th century, but foxes, badgers, and owls are common. Dogs bark across the fields. The village is quiet, but not entirely still. The children sleep close together on straw mats. They scratch at fleas or lice without complaint. Edith lies beside them, with Hugh on the other side. There is no privacy, no doors inside the house, no division between generations. Midnight comes without announcement. Church bells do not toll at this hour in small villages. In towns, the monastic orders might chant matins, but here, there is only silence. Some families, as recorded in rare surviving accounts, would wake for a brief time. This was the first sleep and second sleep, rhythm common before artificial lighting changed the way humans rested. Between these sleeps, people might rise to stir the fire, pray, or even visit neighbors. In the short hours of wakefulness, thoughts deepen. People confessed sins or whispered fears. Edith thinks about the tithe they owe. Hugh wonders if his small barley crop will be enough this year. Alice dreams of becoming a servant in a larger household, a step up, even if it means leaving home. There is little romance in these thoughts. They are utilitarian, steeped in survival, but they are human all the same. Before long, the second sleep begins. The fire, now only coals, glows faintly beneath a skin of white ash. Smoke continues to seep upward, hanging in the low rafters like a ghost. The outside world grows colder still. Frost may form. The family's breath condenses in the air. Rats shuffle near the food stores, but the cat, kept mostly for this purpose, stirs and hisses. In this world, security means simply waking up with your family still alive, your house still standing, and your obligations not yet overdue. And what of those obligations? Each family in this village lives under a fragile balance of duty, labor, and tradition. Tomorrow, a church feast day will excuse them from field work, but not from preparation. The family must offer a chicken to the parish priest, though they only have 2 left. Can they afford it? Hugh and Edith, in their quiet exhaustion, face this question without words. But how did this family come to own even 2 chickens, a field to till, and a house to sleep in? What was the price of stability in a feudal world where land was never truly theirs? In the flickering light of another morning fire, Edith and Hugh awaken not only to their daily tasks, but to their place within a deeply stratified system of ownership and obligation. To understand how they came to possess even the modest comfort of 2 chickens and a small strip of field, one must first understand that they do not truly own these things at all. Land in the medieval English countryside is not a private asset. It is layered with claims: the king, the noble lord of the manor, the church, and finally, the tenant peasant. In 1253, this family lives in a world shaped by feudal tenure, a system that demands service before rights. Hugh is a villain, not a serf in the full sense of enslavement, but still unfree. He cannot leave the manor without permission, nor can he sell his land. His rights are inherited, yes, but his obligations are too. Their small holding, perhaps 20 acres if fortunate, often less, is lent to them in return for labor dues. 3 or more days a week spent on the Lord's land, with additional services during planting and harvest. This means less time on their own crops. It is a delicate calculation how much barley must be grown to survive, how much must be given to the steward, and what little can be kept for barter or storage. The animals they keep, the chickens, the pig, a goat if they're lucky, are not taxed directly, but their products are. Eggs might be required as tithe. A goose, if owned, might be expected as a fee at Michaelmas. And so begins the long arithmetic of survival. The web of dues and payments. The family's week is shaped as much by the manorial calendar as the religious one. Mondays, Tuesdays, and sometimes Wednesdays are spent on the Lord's lands plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting. The remaining days are for their own plot, weather permitting. On Sundays, no fieldwork is done, but the family attends Mass not out of pure piety, but because it is expected, even required. There are payments in kind: bushels of grain, eggs, honey if kept, or cheese if they have enough milk to spare. There are fees in labor: repairing roads, mending fences, clearing woodland. There are ceremonial duties, such as helping to beat the bounds of the parish in spring or carrying produce to the steward's hall. Then there is the Harriet, a payment due upon Hugh's death. His best animal, tool, or garment will be taken by the manor as compensation for allowing the land to pass to his son. If his son cannot pay, the land may not be inherited at all. Their small gains: a wooden chest, an iron cooking pot, a comb, a pair of shoes are counted, remembered, and sometimes taxed. The very items that elevate their comfort are simultaneously liabilities. The manor court. Once a month, the family is expected to attend the manorial court. This is not a place of dramatic legal proceedings, but a gathering of tenants and reeves, presided over by the Lord Steward. Disputes are settled: whose pig trespassed into whose field, who has failed to maintain their portion of the fence, who has withheld grain or missed their labor dues. Justice is local and often communal. Fines are not always monetary. They may take the form of extra work or forfeiture of goods. But the court is also where rights are reaffirmed, where Hugh can argue for a delay in payments or seek permission to pass land to his son. Literacy is rare, and the family does not write. Records are kept on wax tablets or in the steward's bound rolls, in Latin or Norman French. These records are not often read back to the villagers. Power lies in silence and obscurity. The value of a chicken. The 2 chickens scratching near the door may seem insignificant, but in a medieval economy, a laying hen is a source of eggs, which can be eaten or traded. A hen also produces chicks, which can replenish the flock or be sold. A single egg could be bartered for a handful of onions or a service from a neighbor. The chickens are kept close, not only to protect them from foxes, but because their manure helps enrich the garden soil. The children know to feed them scraps, to guard them, to count them. In hard times, a chicken may be eaten, but this is a last resort. Killing a laying hen is a sacrifice. It means losing a recurring source of sustenance. In times of famine, such choices can mean the difference between survival and hunger. Continuity and custom. Though they are poor, Hugh and Edith are not destitute. Their position, meager as it may be, offers a form of security. The Lord does not own their bodies. He controls their labor and their land, but he does not seek their ruin. A dead peasant pays no taxes. This balance, precarious but consistent, is maintained through custom. These customs are unwritten but fiercely remembered. They protect peasants from sudden changes in obligation. If a steward tries to raise labor dues beyond what is traditional, the village may protest, citing memory and precedent. It is this memory, not books or documents, that shapes their world. The ringing of time. With no clocks, time is measured by natural rhythms and the church bell. Bells mark hours for prayer, meals, and work. Sunrise and sunset are the real markers. Seasons guide planting. The moon shapes fishing and travel at night. Time is communal, not personal. The day ends again with the return of Hugh from the field, the fetching of water, the quiet spinning, and the simple meal. Nothing has changed, and yet everything is maintained. Survival in this world is not a moment of triumph but a continued act of participation. The family eats again from a single pot. There is no table. The food is thick barley pottage with leeks from the garden. There is bread hard and dark, chewed slowly. Tomorrow may bring rain, or visitors, or illness. But tonight the chickens are quiet, the children are warm, and the roof has not leaked. This, in 1253, is success. But how long could this system of custom and obligation last? When would this quiet balance begin to unravel what could shake the centuries-old agreement between lord and laborer? Story 2. How food was stored through brutal winters. In the quiet breath between autumn's final harvest and the deep onset of winter, there exists a silent urgency, the need to preserve food. In a time before refrigeration, before foil-wrapped perishables and climate-controlled storage, every family, noble, peasant, and priest alike faced the same unyielding problem: how to keep food edible during months of cold, scarcity, and isolation. You may imagine winter as still and beautiful, a time for rest beside the fire. But to a medieval family, especially one of modest means, winter was a test, and food was at the center of that test. Let us step into the late 13th century, in a rural village near the edge of the Black Forest in what is now southern Germany. The harvest has ended. Grains have been threshed. vegetables pulled, and animals butchered. The family of Hans and Gertrude, tenant farmers on a minor noble's estate, has just completed their final gleaning from the fields. The work of growing is done, but now the more important labor begins, storing and preserving. The slaughtering season. Meat was never a daily part of most medieval diets. It was expensive, precious, and often tied to feast days. But when it was eaten, especially in winter, it had to be preserved. The time between Michaelmas, September 29, and Martinmas, November 11, was known as the slaughtering season, particularly for pigs. Pigs were ideal for peasant families. Unlike cows or oxen, which were needed for milk or labor, pigs could be fattened quickly and slaughtered young. They ate scraps, foraged in forests, and required little pasture. Hans and Gertrude's family has just slaughtered 2 pigs. The butchering is done outside, on a wooden table near the well. The blood is collected for sausage or for puddings. Nothing is wasted. Gertrude scrapes the hair from the carcass using scalding water and a dull knife. Her fingers are red and raw from the work. The children help separate fat from lean meat. Neighbors assist, because butchering is time-sensitive and must be done quickly before flies or decay set in. Now comes the decision. What meat can be eaten now and what must be preserved? Salt, the essential mineral. The primary method of preservation was salting. Salt was not rare, but it was not cheap either. It was mined in places like Salzburg or transported from coastal salt pans in France and England. For inland families, it was acquired through barter, perhaps traded for a sack of grain or a cask of ale. Meat intended for storage would be rubbed heavily with salt, layer upon layer. Cuts of pork were placed into wooden barrels, packed with dry salt and sometimes herbs, bay, juniper, or mustard seed. The salt would draw moisture from the meat, creating a brine. After several weeks in the brine, the meat would be hung in a cool, dark place, usually a cellar or the rafters of the house. This meat was now safe to eat for weeks, even months, though it would be tough, salty, and dry. Before cooking, it would need to be soaked in water to soften. Salt also preserved fish, which was essential on church-mandated fast days, when meat could not be consumed. For families far from the sea, salt cod or herring became a dietary mainstay. These fish were transported inland, stacked in great salted piles on carts, sometimes arriving moldy or hard as stone. Still, people bought them. A spoiled fish was better than no fish at all. Smoke, the slow cure. Another common technique was smoking. After salting, some meats would be hung over a low fire, usually of hardwood like oak or beech, and left to smoke for days, even weeks. The smokehouse was often nothing more than a small outbuilding with no chimney. The fire would be kept constantly smoldering, producing smoke without large flames. This smoke dried the meat further, coating it with chemicals that inhibited bacterial growth. For Hans and Gertrude, smoking pork belly would produce something like bacon, though far more rustic than modern versions. Sausages, too, were hung to dry and smoke, tied with animal gut. Cheese could also be smoked, though only harder varieties. Smoked cheese lasted longer and took on a bitter edge that many found pleasant, especially in times when flavor was secondary to survival. The air in and around the house often smelled of smoke, not just from the hearth, but from meat and fish hanging near the rafters. The roof beams blackened over time, but the scent was comforting. It meant there would be food. Root cellars and the art of storage. Not everything could be salted or smoked. Much of the medieval diet relied on vegetables, onions, leeks, beans, parsnips, turnips, and perhaps most importantly, cabbage. These were stored through more passive methods. A root cellar was the medieval equivalent of a refrigerator. Dug into the earth or built partially underground, it stayed cool and moist year-round. The earth itself insulated the contents. Vegetables were stored in straw or sand to prevent rot. Some were hung in nets or baskets. The family checked the cellar weekly. Rot could spread fast if a single turnip spoiled. Grains were stored in sacks or bins, elevated from the ground to keep them dry and away from rodents. Mice and rats were constant threats. Cats were kept for this reason. Dogs, too, were trained to kill vermin. Apples were laid out on racks, with careful spacing to avoid bruising. Pears were boiled into preserves or dried in ovens when possible. Plums became prunes, grapes became raisins if the harvest allowed. Drying was done in the sun or near the hearth, though fire drying often risked burning. Even eggs could be stored. Some were preserved in ash or lime water, or packed in brine to keep them fresh for weeks. Bread, ale, and other staples. Bread and ale were daily essentials, but they too required planning. Bread, especially in peasant homes, was made from coarse flour, rye, barley, or oat. Wheat was reserved for the wealthy. The bread was often dense, sour, and filled with chaff. Some households had access to a communal oven. Others used their own hearth. To prolong its life, bread could be dried into rusks, hard biscuits that softened in soup or pottage. These lasted much longer than fresh loaves. Ale was brewed weekly or monthly, using leftover grains. It provided calories and was safer to drink than water, which was often contaminated. Ale did not store well, however, so it was drunk quickly and often weak. The problem of salt again. Salt, so central to preservation, remained a limited commodity. It was used sparingly. Some families used ash and herbs to stretch their supplies. In very poor homes, meats might be buried in grain or packed in honey, if available, but these methods were uncommon. Salt was also political. In some regions, it was taxed heavily, and salt smugglers emerged. Whole villages depended on single salt merchants whose wagons might be delayed by snow or stolen on the road. Without salt, meat spoiled. Entire stores might rot and hunger would follow. The silence of winter. And so the preparation continued, day after day. The family worked not in bursts, but in long, repetitive cycles, checking cellars, rotating stores, drying herbs, boiling preserves. Every act had a consequence. A poorly salted ham could ruin. A leak in the cellar could destroy an entire season's grain. A single hungry rat could turn one family's winter into a fight for survival. The house became a warehouse. Rafters held meat and garlic. Baskets held beans and turnips. Jars were sealed with wax or lard. It was not orderly. It was cluttered, uneven, and earthy. But it was survival. Yet even with the best laid plans, what happened when winter stretched longer than expected? When rats came, or rot spread, or the salt merchant never returned? At first, winter brings stillness. Snow drapes the thatched rooftops. Smoke rises from every chimney. The paths to the well and the privy are trodden but crusted with ice. Inside, the house is dim and close. The fire is never allowed to die. Its heat is a lifeline not just for warmth, but for food preparation, for drying clothes, for keeping spirits from drifting into despair. But as the weeks pass, by mid-January, perhaps families begin to look at their stores differently. What was abundance in November now looks fragile in the cold light of a hungry month. The smoked meats grow dry and hard. The salted pork tastes sharper, almost bitter. The root vegetables wrinkle, soften, and grow hairline cracks. Cellars, once sources of pride, begin to smell slightly off. Gertrude notices that the apples are turning faster now. One bad spot spreads through the basket. She throws out the worst of them, but not far, perhaps into the slop bucket, to be fed to the pigs when spring returns. Waste is unacceptable, even now. The unseen spoilage. Not all spoilage is visible. Grains might harbor weevils or mold. Damp air creeps into barrels. A forgotten crack in the wall of the root cellar becomes a pathway for mice. The grain once counted out in sacks may now show signs of chewing, with small brown droppings in its place. By February, the family notices that one sack of rye has a sour smell. It may still be edible, but it could cause illness. Hands debates tossing it, but instead they decide to mix it with better grain, grinding it into flour to be used cautiously, perhaps for pottage rather than bread, so it can be boiled. If it is truly bad, it may contain ergot, a toxic fungus that causes hallucinations, convulsions, or death. The villagers call it St. Anthony's fire. They do not know the cause, but they know what happens. Gertrude, who has seen such things before, throws out the darkest kernels. She says nothing to the children. The firewood problem. There is another growing concern: firewood. Meat preserved with salt still needs to be boiled. Dried vegetables must be rehydrated. Nothing is simply eaten cold. But by now, the stack of firewood has shrunk to a fraction of its original size. The family begins burning less than ideal wood, green branches, damp bark, even dried dung. The fire smokes more than it warms. The soot is thick. The children cough. Gertrude tries to cook everything in one pot now to save fuel and stretch ingredients. She adds more water to the pottage, more oats, fewer vegetables. A thin soup is less satisfying, but it fills the belly. Barter, begging, and borrowing. By late winter, even the best prepared families must look outward. The village economy was built for this moment. Gertrude walks to the neighboring cottage with a small jar of rendered lard and 2 smoked sausages. She trades them for dried peas. Not much, but it will add substance to their meals. Some villagers borrow grain from the manor's stores. If allowed, though, repayment will be expected at harvest with interest. Others beg. It is not seen as shameful. Winter humbles everyone. The parish priest distributes alms, mostly to widows or the elderly. Occasionally, a kind steward will forgive a day of labor in exchange for a good faith promise of future dues. But such mercy is rare. No one forgets debts. They are recorded, not always in ink, but in memory and in expectation. The living thread of rats. If ever there were a true villain in the medieval food story, it is the rat. Rats come not only for grain, but for salted meat, cheese, even soap. They gnaw through wooden barrels, chew through walls, and steal at night. They spread filth and disease. Their presence is a sign that your stores are valuable and vulnerable. Cats are kept, of course, but they are not always enough. Hans and his sons hang traps, simple loops of cord baited with cheese rinds. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. The rats grow bolder as winter deepens. One night, Gertrude wakes to the sound of a scratching near the rafters. The next morning, a smoked ham has fallen, gnawed and useless. They throw it out, a heavy loss. Candlelight and cold meals. By now, meals are shrinking. Breakfast is often skipped. Midday is the main meal, followed by a modest supper, often just ale and a bit of bread. Candles made from tallow are saved for emergencies. The home is dark in the mornings and darker still in the evenings. Time stretches out slow, uncomfortable, filled with shivering. Children complain of hunger, not loudly. They are used to hunger, but it makes them sluggish. Their work slows. Edith grows more irritable. So does Hans. Tension thickens, but no one dares give it voice. They are luckier than some. A neighboring family has run out of grain entirely and is now boiling acorn mush, bitter and barely edible. Another man was caught stealing turnips from the manor garden. He was lashed publicly. Even in hunger, law remains. Hunger and penance. The church says that fasting is good for the soul, and Lent often falls during this time, late winter or early spring. It is a season of penitence, of going without. But for peasants, the idea of voluntary fasting is complicated. Hunger is not chosen. It is enforced by the season. Still, they go to Mass, they sing the hymns. The priest preaches about suffering and redemption. He reminds them of Job, of saints who ate only roots and drank only dew. Some believe, others endure. The idea of spiritual hunger is not abstract. It overlays a very real bodily emptiness. Signs of hope. And then signs begin to change. A bird call not heard since autumn. The slow drip of snowmelt from the roof. The first green shoots of nettle or wild garlic near the edge of the woods. Tiny, persistent hints that the world will turn again. Gertrude finds the first eggs in weeks. A chicken, long quiet, has laid again. The yolk is small, the shell pale, but it is precious beyond words. Hans checks the barley bin and calculates how many more weeks it might stretch. The answer is not generous, but it is possible. Even the children begin to smile again. The days grow longer. Yet spring brings its own dangers. Floods, diseases stirred by the thaw, the anxiety of planting anew with limited seed. How did families recover from the toll of winter, and what systems ensured they could begin again, year after year? The last snows retreat in patches. The fields emerge slowly, splotched with standing water and last year's stubble. It is not yet time to sow, but it is time to hope. By mid-March, Hans is already inspecting the ground, pushing his booted heel into the soil to test for softness, turning it with a spade to see if the earth is ready to be broken again. But the work of renewal, as essential as the harvest, is not limited to soil. It begins first within the home, within the very heart of survival, the food store. The root cellar smells different now, warmer, wetter. The lingering cold that once preserved now threatens to rot. Gertrude moves quickly. What remains of the onions are sorted, some sprouting, some softened beyond use. Those that can be saved are chopped and added to broth. The rest are composted or thrown into the pig pen. Salted meats, too, are checked. Anything too dry is softened and eaten. It will not keep through the heat of summer. This is not a time of bounty. This is the hungry gap that stretches between the end of winter stores and the beginning of new growth. But it is also a time of activity, a time to begin again. Preparing to sow. With the last handfuls of grain kept carefully aside, Hans begins the painful arithmetic of seed. Each sack of barley, each scoop of rye is both food and potential. Eat it and you live today. Sow it and you live next season. He sets aside just enough to sow his strip only after setting aside what must be paid to the Lord's steward. The manner's expectations do not shrink with the season. If he fails to sow, he fails to harvest, and if he fails to harvest, he fails to pay. And failure means forfeiture. Gertrude and the children prepare the fields, removing stones, straightening the furrows left from last year. The oxen, thin from winter, are coaxed into service. They are essential and irreplaceable. The planting is done in hope, but also with the memory of last year's hunger. It must go well. Spring cleaning in the medieval sense. We speak of spring cleaning today as ritual or preference, but in the medieval household, it was a necessity. As temperatures rise, the pests return. Rats breed. Insects crawl from cracks in the wood. Spoiled food attracts flies and disease. Gertrude scours the floor with lime wash, scrubs wooden bins with hot water and ashes, and burns herbs like wormwood or mugwort to repel vermin. Old sacks are discarded or mended, jars are resealed, traps are reset. She burns or buries anything that smells off, anything that might harbor contagion. The Black Death lies a century ahead, but even now, people know that filth and illness go together. Early harvests and foraging. By April, the natural world begins to offer its first gifts. Eggs, once scarce, become regular again. Hens roam freely, feeding on bugs and kitchen scraps. Their yolks are golden, richer than winter's offerings. Wild herbs emerge: nettle, sorrel, ramsons, wild garlic. These greens, gathered from hedgerows and woodland margins, are not just nutrition, they are relief. They brighten the pottage, freshen the breath, cleanse the gut. Children are sent to forage. They know what to look for, what not to touch, what to bring back. Some families keep small garden plots with leeks or cress, protected through winter by straw and ash. These now spring back to life. Gertrude boils the greens, sometimes with vinegar or whey, and mixes them into broth. It is not luxurious, but it is different, and that difference matters. Preparing for the next cycle. The pigs are lean now, but alive. They will be fed again on scraps, acorns, and gleanings until they are fat enough to slaughter come autumn. A new piglet is born. The children marvel. Hands nod silently. Each new life is an asset, an obligation, a form of stored food. Gertrude watches the sky more now. Rain is both blessing and threat. The timing of the sowing is crucial. A late frost could destroy all hope. A cold snap could drive new chicks to death. Each season has its risks. Manorial records and memory. At the manor court, the steward takes note of who sowed what and where. These records are less precise than modern ledgers, but they are serious. Dues will be calculated from them. Hans remembers a time years ago when a neighbor sowed late, harvested poorly, and had to sell his ox to repay the tithe. He never recovered. He died in debt. His son became a day laborer. So Hans sows carefully, thoroughly. He sharpens his tools. He teaches his son how to look for signs in the soil, the color, the dampness, the depth at which it clumps. It is knowledge passed down without writing. The role of the church in spring. With Lent ending and Easter approaching, the church offers renewal of a different sort. The priest speaks of resurrection and redemption. He blesses the fields. He blesses the seeds. He blesses the families, especially those who endured the winter without starving. At Easter Mass, a richer meal is shared. Perhaps a chicken, eggs dyed with plants, beets, onion skins, nettles. The family may drink stronger ale. The children might even receive a honey cake if supplies allow. It is not abundance, but it is celebration. And celebration in these circumstances is powerful. It says, we made it. Continuity and the quiet wisdom of repetition. Now the cycle resumes. New pickles will be made. Fresh herbs will be dried and stored. Salt will be acquired for the coming season. The family will prepare for the next slaughtering time before summer even begins. Every mistake learned from this past winter, every spoiled apple, every burst sack of grain is remembered. Gertrude will check the cellar more often. Hans will try a new method of stacking sacks to keep them off the damp ground. The knowledge is never written, but it is retained, passed on, embedded in practice. To live through a medieval winter was not simply to survive, it was to adapt, store, labor, calculate, and endure. It required patience, planning, and a kind of quiet brilliance, the wisdom to work with time, not against it. Gertrude stands at the edge of her garden plot, rake in hand, and looks out over the field just sown. She does not smile, but she exhales. Another season has begun. How did other medieval cultures far from this quiet German village adapt to winter's trials? How did Norse, Slavic, or Mediterranean households solve the same problem of keeping hunger at bay? Story 3. The work of women in spinning, weaving, and clothing the household. If you were to walk into a medieval village home at almost any hour of daylight, and often by candle or firelight in the early hours or after dark, you would likely find a woman spinning. Not loudly, not with ceremony, but quietly, steadily, methodically. A spindle in hand, a bundle of wool at her side, an emotion so repetitive it becomes invisible to those around her. This is the spinning woman, a fixture of medieval life. She is not a guild-trained artisan. She does not appear in heroic tales or grand histories, but she is one of the most critical engines of survival in the medieval household economy. Without her there would be no thread, and without thread there is nothing. No clothes, no sails, no blankets, no nets, no bags, no bindings for books, no wicks for candles. Thread is life, and it begins at the spindle. From sheep to spindle. Let us return to the English countryside, around the year 1275. It is early spring. In a modest village near the Welsh border, a family prepares to shear their sheep. They own just a few, 3, perhaps 4, kept more for wool than meat. The sheep are not large or especially fluffy like modern breeds. Their wool is coarse and full of lanolin, dung, twigs, and burrs. Shearing is done with large iron shears, awkward, dull, and tiring. Gerald the father holds the animal. The oldest son cuts. The fleece comes off in uneven patches. Once removed, it is handed to Maud, the mother, who will spend weeks preparing it. Washing and carding. The wool cannot be spun straight from the sheep. It must be washed, usually with urine or lye soap, to remove grease and dirt. This is not a pleasant job. The stench of wet wool and ammonia is sharp and lingering. After washing, the wool must dry fully. Only then is it ready to be carded, a process of combing the fibers to align them and remove debris. Carding is done with 2 wooden paddles covered in iron teeth or even thistles. This is where the children help. Even a 7-year-old can card wool. It is dull work and repetitive but essential. A poorly carded batch will tangle during spinning. Time lost cannot be reclaimed. Carding might take place beside the hearth or on a bench in the sun. It is a social task done in groups when possible. Maud might visit another home and work alongside neighbors, trading gossip and advice as they prepare their wool together. The drop spindle. Once carded, the wool becomes Raleg's small tubes of soft fiber, ready to be spun. Maud uses a drop spindle, not a spinning wheel. The wheel exists in some parts of Europe by now, but it is rare and expensive. The spindle is simpler, a weighted stick with a notch, spun by hand. She twirls it, lets it drop, and feeds wool into the twist with practiced fingers. The motion is rhythmic, meditative, even beautiful in its repetition. It continues through all seasons, during chores, walking, nursing. It never truly stops. A single spindle of yarn might take hours to fill. Many are needed to make enough for weaving. The spinning of thread is an invisible labor done not in workshops but in kitchens, courtyards, and fields. It is a task for women and girls. Boys might spin in childhood, but by adolescence they turn to field work. Girls often continue through marriage and old age. A woman who cannot spin is considered a burden. Thread as currency. The thread Maud produces is not only for her family's use, it is tradable. She can barter skeins of spun yarn for eggs, grain, or help with harvest. In some cases, she might be contracted to spin for a wealthier family, paid in kind or coin. The quality of her thread matters. Tightness, consistency, color, all are judged. A well-respected spinner builds quiet influence in the community. Thread becomes part of the local economy, part of the web of mutual dependence that defines village life. Even without a loom of her own, Maud contributes. She spins what others will weave. Fiber beyond wool. While wool is dominant, it is not alone. Flax, grown in wetter soils, provides linen. It is harder to process than wool, requiring retting, rotting the stalks in water, beating, drying, and combing with brutal iron tools called hackles. Linen is prized for undergarments and summer clothing. It is lighter, cleaner, and smoother than wool, but it is labor-intensive. Whole villages might share in processing a flax harvest. Hemp is also spun, especially for rope and sackcloth. It is coarse and rough, rarely worn against the skin. Silk is unknown in most households, limited to clergy and nobility. Cotton is virtually absent from Northern Europe in this period. The world of medieval fabric is narrow, but rich in texture and meaning. The work beneath the work. And here we reach the central truth. Spinning is not simply about clothing. It is about sufficiency. A family that cannot clothe itself cannot survive. Garments are patched endlessly. When a tunic becomes too small for the eldest son, it is passed down to the younger. When it becomes threadbare, it is cut into pieces for a child's smock. When those scraps wear out, they become rags for the kitchen, stuffing for a pillow, or bindings for wounds. Every thread has a life, a purpose, and a final use. Maud knows this. She calculates thread in her head, not in numbers but in uses. This spindle for socks, this one for mending, this batch for barter. She has no ledger, but she has memory, and memory sustains her. Spinning after dark. After the fire is banked and the children are asleep, Maud may still spin. Her spindle turns beside the embers, casting shadows on the low, smoky ceiling. The work is gentle but endless. She turns wool into thread, thread into warmth, warmth into survival. There is no celebration of her labor. It is too ordinary, too constant, but it is essential. What happens next when the thread becomes cloth? Who weaves it? Where is it made? And how does cloth become clothing in the world of limited tools and even more limited time? When Maud rises early the next morning just as the fire is stirred, just before the sky begins to color, her fingers are already busy. Today is not for spinning. Today is for weaving. Where spinning was quiet and continuous, weaving is loud and laborious. The transformation of thread into cloth is not delicate. It is mechanical, rhythmic, and absolutely vital. This process doesn't happen overnight, nor does it happen every day. Cloth making is done in spurts when enough thread has been spun, when weather permits, when children can be occupied. The importance of the loom. The family's loom is a vertical warp-weighted loom, the most common in this period for rural households. It is made of roughly hewn wood, leaning slightly against the interior wall of their cottage. Simple but serviceable. Its basic parts: warp threads which hang vertically, weights typically made of clay or stone, tied to the end of each warp to keep it taut, a heddle rod, which allows alternating warp threads to be raised or lowered to create a gap, and a shuttle which carries the weft horizontal thread back and forth. The loom is not a passive device. It is a machine powered by human labor, almost always women's labor. Maud threads the loom slowly, carefully, stringing warp after warp, measuring with her fingers. A mistake here, one skipped thread, will ruin the whole cloth. This process alone can take an entire day. Weaving in practice. Once the warp is prepared and the loom strung, the weft thread is passed through using the shuttle, alternating under and over. Each pass must be beaten tight to avoid gaps. The beater, often just a shaped stick, is used with force. Arms tire quickly. The process is slow. A small bolt of cloth, perhaps enough for a tunic, might take a week or more. If mistakes are made, it must be unwoven and redone. But this labor is not seen as special. It is expected. For a peasant household, clothing is not purchased. It is grown, processed, spun, and woven by hand. Purchased cloth, when available at market, is expensive and typically reserved for wealthier folk or special garments like Sunday best. Cloth made at home is functional, not decorative. It is thick, coarse, often uneven in color, but it is warm, it is sufficient. Dyeing and fulling. If Maud is fortunate, she might dye the cloth. Natural dyes are gathered from the fields. Woad for blue, a time-consuming, smelly process. Madder root for reddish tones. Walnut husks for brown. Onion skins, nettles, or iron filings for shades of yellow or gray. The dyeing is done before or after weaving, depending on the method. The yarn is boiled in the dye bath, sometimes for hours, then hung to dry. Mordants like alum or urine are used to fix the color. The smell lingers. But many families do not dye at all. Cloth is left undyed, natural white, beige, or gray, the colors of sheep. This is more practical, faster, and requires fewer materials. A stained tunic matters little in the fields. After weaving, the cloth might be fulled, soaked, beaten, and walked on in water to shrink and thicken the fabric. Some households do this in tubs. Others use communal fulling ponds or send it to a nearby fuller. The fuller may be a man, but his labor, like Maud, is physically intense and often underappreciated. Cutting and sewing. Once dried and shrunk, the cloth is cut with shears. There are no patterns. The pieces are simple, rectangles and triangles. A tunic is 2 panels joined at the sides and shoulders. Sleeves are added, sometimes gussets under the arms for movement. Every scrap is used. Even threads from the loom's trimming are saved for mending. Sewing is done by hand, with bone or iron needles, using thread spun at home. A linen inner layer might be added if available, especially for infants or the sick. The seams are stitched with care, but not for elegance, for durability. This is not fashion, it is engineering. The shared economy of cloth. Maud does not weave alone. In many villages, women work together on larger looms, horizontal looms, sometimes operated in barns or sheds. These are often used for making sheets, blankets, or communal cloth for barter or sale. This cooperation lightens the burden. It also ensures consistency. A group of women might pool wool, divide labor, and produce enough cloth for multiple families in one season. There is pride in good cloth. A well-woven bolt, smooth and tight, is a mark of skill. Some women become known for their spinning, others for weaving, others for dyeing. Though they may never own property, they own their reputations. Maud might take a bolt of her cloth to market not for coins, but to trade for beeswax, salt, or even a copper pin for her daughter's hair. The value of this cloth is not in its beauty, it is in its usefulness. A cloak that repels rain, a blanket that shields from frost, a tunic that lasts through a season of toil. Children and clothing. For children, clothing is sparse and repurposed. A child wears what is available. Tunics are shortened as they grow, sleeves let out, patches added. Shoes are rare. Many children go barefoot most of the year, even in cold months. When a child outgrows a tunic, the fabric is not discarded. It becomes rags, quilted into bedding, or sewn into swaddling bands for infants. Boys and girls alike wear the same tunics until adolescence. Only at maturity do gender distinctions in clothing become notable, boys gaining belts, girls gaining aprons or fitted sleeves. The weight of work. Weaving is seasonal. In winter, the cold slows the fingers. In summer, there is too much field work. Spring and autumn are best. But the need for clothing never pauses. Children grow, cloth wears thin, and mending is constant. The weight of this labor is invisible in most records. Chroniclers mention markets and taxes, but rarely the domestic labor that made every tunic, sock, and sheet possible. Maud never stops, she cannot. If she does, her family goes without. She does not call herself a weaver, but she is. She does not write her name, but her work surrounds the household. It warms, binds, protects, and dignifies. Still, the question remains, how long could these garments last? And what happened when even repair was no longer enough, when clothing fell apart or disaster struck? How did the medieval household stretch every fiber to its breaking point? The medieval household, however modest, was a world built on scarcity, where waste was luxury, and every object had a second, third, even fourth life. This was truest of all when it came to clothing and textiles. By the time a tunic appeared faded or a cloak wore thin, it had already outlived many of the tools used to make it. Clothing in the 13th century was not disposable. It was maintained. It was patched. It was altered, turned, and eventually dismantled and redistributed throughout the household. The final act of cloth, its last transformation, was just as vital as its making. The art of mending. The moment a seam splits or a hem frays, the response is not frustration, it is repair. Maud keeps a basket of thread scraps, cuttings from older garments, and bits of cloth too small to sew into anything new but perfect for patches. Sitting beside the hearth, she examines her husband's woolen tunic. The elbows are thinning. She will darn them using a mushroom-shaped piece of wood placed under the fabric. Her needle moves in slow, looping stitches that mimic the woven texture, reinforcing the area with thread nearly identical in color. If the damage is large, she patches instead, but not haphazardly. The patch is sewn from older fabric with wear of its own fabric that already knows the labor of the field, that moves like the garment it restores. Sometimes the repair is visible bright threads in a sea of brown or gray, but this is not shameful. It is proof of care. A well-mended tunic is a mark of diligence. Repurposing the unwearable. Eventually all garments reach their end. Cloth thins, threads separate, seams cannot hold, but even now the fabric is not discarded. Maud may cut a ruined shift into bandages, folded neatly and stored in a basket for wounds or childbirth. The softest parts become cloths for swaddling infants. Stronger parts are sewn into mittens, foot wraps, or liners for shoes. In the kitchen, they serve as towels, strainers, or pot holders. Some are twisted into ropes or bindings for sacks and bundles. Children's dolls are often made from scraps of linen or wool stuffed with rags, dressed in miniature tunics sewn from patches. Even play is woven from necessity. No piece is wasted until it is dust. Clothing and identity. Though practical, clothing also signals identity. A patched cloak may mark a poor farmer, but a well-kept one marks a woman who can spin and mend, even with little. Clothing communicates marriage status, age, occupation, and wealth, however modest. Colors matter. White linen suggests cleanliness and purity. Red may imply festivity. Deep blue dyed with woad is prized, but often fades. Dyes are expensive and fade quickly. A dress once dyed yellow with weld may fade to dull brown within a year. Even within limits, clothing choices reflect pride, memory, and community. The stitching patterns Maud uses on hems may echo her mother. The patch on her daughter's sleeve may come from a wedding garment now too worn to wear, but never too worn to use. Clothing carries stories. When disaster strikes, fire is feared, so is flood. One careless spark from the hearth can undo months of spinning and weaving in minutes. In such cases, communities often rally. A woman whose loom is lost in a fire may receive spun wool from neighbors. A family whose clothes are ruined in a storm may be gifted a shift or blanket. But these are gestures made from shared scarcity, not surplus. There is no storehouse, no backup. Rebuilding begins immediately. And it begins with spinning. Cloth in death. Even in death, cloth plays its part. A burial shroud is usually simple linen undyed, unadorned. Wealthier villagers might be buried in a favorite tunic. Others are wrapped in worn but whole cloth, sometimes with a cross stitched into the hem. Maud may prepare such cloth herself, folding it, stitching it, pressing it under weight to keep it flat. The same hands that dressed her children in swaddling bands will one day prepare her husband's final garment. Clothing marks every passage of life: birth, growth, marriage, labor, sickness, and death. The threads that remain. When we imagine the past, we often picture the stone, the iron, the monumental. But the medieval world was not only built of castles and swords. It was woven thread by women like Maud. She will never appear in a chronicle. Her name is not recorded, but the warmth in her child's blanket, the tunic that shields her husband from cold, the cloth that binds a wound, all these are her legacy. And the skill does not die with her. Her daughter, already learning to spin, already threading needles with fat fingers and stubborn pride, will carry it forward. The household survives not because of one grand harvest or one great act, but because every day thread becomes cloth, cloth becomes clothing, and clothing becomes care. So much of this survival rests on domestic knowledge passed quietly from hand to hand. But how did women share these skills beyond the home? What were the communal spaces, gatherings, or events where knowledge of cloth, dye, and thread was exchanged across generations and villages? Story 4. The hidden labor of medieval women. It is early morning, just before the sky begins to pale, and a heavy, yeasty scent fills the air. In the small village near the edge of the Cotswolds, a low hearth flickers to life beneath a clay oven. Marjorie, the village's most reliable brewer and baker, is already at work. Her hands, cracked and red from years of labor, are covered in flour and dough. In a large copper cauldron nearby, a mash of barley and warm water is beginning to bubble gently. This is no commercial kitchen, nor a professional alehouse. It is a simple timber-framed cottage with a dirt floor, one window, and a smoke hole in the roof. And yet, within this humble space, two of the most vital products in medieval daily life are made: bread and ale. Bread and ale, the twin pillars of the medieval diet. For most medieval people, especially in Northern Europe, bread and ale were not luxuries, they were staples, consumed with nearly every meal. These two items provided the bulk of daily calories, especially for peasants. Rich and poor alike depended on them, but only the wealthy could afford to purchase them regularly. In villages, it was women who produced these goods at home, by hand, in batches small enough to serve their households, but often large enough to support neighbors too. Bread was made almost daily, though larger baking days happened once or twice per week. Ale was brewed as needed, usually every few days, as it did not keep well and grew sour quickly. The work was demanding, repetitive, and time-sensitive. It required attention to heat, texture, timing, and instinct. There were no thermometers, no timers, only experience and memory. Marjorie does not think of herself as a master craftswoman, but her skill with yeast, heat, and grain means the difference between nourishment and sickness for those who rely on her. The village oven. In smaller homes, baking was often done in a communal oven. These were stone or clay structures, sometimes built by the lord of the manor, sometimes by the villagers themselves. Heated with wood fires built inside the chamber, the embers would later be swept out and the oven packed with loaves, which baked in retained heat. The timing of access to the oven was critical. Villagers often took turns, each woman knowing her window by tradition or arrangement. Some lords charged a bake fee, or banalité, for use of the communal oven, essentially a tax on bread itself. Today, Marjorie bakes at home. Her oven is smaller, lined with clay, and she heats it with wood from a nearby coppice. Once the flames die down, she places flat loaves inside, heavy, dark, and coarse. The flour she uses is mostly rye or barley, sifted through cloth to remove larger husks. Wheat is reserved for the wealthy or for holy days. The realities of bread making. Making bread is not a simple matter of mixing and waiting. First, grain must be ground. This is often done at the village mill, where Marjorie brings a sack of barley and receives flour in return minus the miller's toll, a portion taken as payment. Sometimes, if the line is long or the weather poor, she grinds by hand using a quern stone, a backbreaking task that can take hours to produce enough flour for a few loaves. The dough is mixed with water, salt precious and sparingly used, and sometimes a sour leaven scraped from the last batch. There is no commercial yeast. Rising is unpredictable. Time, humidity, and temperature all affect the result. While the dough rises, Marjorie stokes the oven, feeds her chickens, stirs her brewing pot, and watches her youngest child. She is always doing three things at once. The loaves she bakes are not light and airy. They are dense, chewy, and crusted with ash. Sometimes they contain grit from the millstones, which slowly wears down the teeth of all who eat them. Still, it is filling. It sustains. Ale, the safer drink. Though clean water existed in some places, ale was the primary beverage of choice for most people in medieval Europe. It was safer than water, offered valuable calories, and was drunk by children and adults alike. Ale was not beer in the modern sense. It contained no hops, which were not commonly used in England until the 15th century. It was mild, lightly alcoholic, and cloudy. Its production was part of the household rhythm, as essential as baking. To brew ale, Marjorie soaks malted barley in warm water to create a mash, which is heated gently to extract the sugars. The liquid wort is then separated and boiled. Sometimes herbs like gruit, a mix of yarrow, bog myrtle, or rosemary, are added for flavor and mild preservation. Once cooled, the wort is left to ferment, often relying on wild yeasts from the air or from wooden brewing vessels that retain yeast from previous batches. This means every brew is unique, some sweet, some sour, some barely drinkable. If a batch turns bad, it must be discarded, a serious loss. Brewing takes 2 to 3 days. The ale keeps for only a few more. It is drunk while fresh, served in earthen mugs or wooden cups, often with meals or as a meal itself. Alewives in the household economy. Marjorie is an alewife, not a title she uses, but a role everyone in the village knows. She brews for her family, but also sells or trades small measures of ale to neighbors. A few pennies here, a bit of cheese there. It adds up. Alewives were often viewed with a mixture of respect and suspicion. They held economic power in a world that offered women few official positions. Brewing was one of the few trades outside textile work where a woman could earn and manage income independently. Their ale was subject to inspection. The local ale taster, often appointed by the manor or town, would test batches for strength, purity, and price. Poor quality or overcharging could result in fines, public shamming, or even temporary banning from brewing. Still, the work continued. Too many relied on it. Feeding the village. Between her loaves and her ale, Marjorie feeds more than just her family. She supports field workers, visiting traders, and neighbors who may not have the tools or time to bake or brew themselves. On holy days, she bakes special loaves, sweeter if she can afford honey, marked with crosses or symbols. Sometimes bread is offered at church. Sometimes it is bartered to settle debts. Sometimes a loaf is wrapped in cloth and brought to a sick elder, a silent act of care. Her work is not solitary. Her daughters help knead dough. A neighbor might assist in watching the mash or turning the loaves in the oven. Recipes are passed orally, measurements by handful, instructions by memory. The rhythm of her work is as regular as the church bell. Rise, grind, mix, tend, shape, bake, cool, serve. The process is continuous, but what happens when it is disrupted? What if a batch of ale goes sour, or flour runs short? How did women like Marjorie adapt when weather, illness, or social constraints interrupted this essential labor? Marjorie lifts the wooden lid from her brewing vat and immediately knows something is wrong. The smell is off, sour, yes, but not in the clean, yeasty way that signals good fermentation. This is sharp, musty, and faintly moldy. She stirs it with a long paddle, watches the foam rise, and sees the thin skin forming on the surface. The ale has spoiled. When the ale turns, ale, though safer than water, is fragile. Without hops to preserve it, it spoils easily. Wild yeast is unpredictable. A shift in temperature, a draft through the brewing room, an unclean vessel, any of these can sour a batch beyond saving. In summer, the risk grows higher. A ruined brew means wasted grain, wasted labor, and lost income. For a woman like Marjorie, already budgeting every sack of barley and every penny from her sales, this loss is real. There is no compensation. There is no insurance. There is only starting again. Spoiled ale must be thrown out or used to feed animals. Sometimes it can be boiled into gruel, but it is no longer drinkable. It brings shame, too. Word spreads quickly in small villages. The alewife with sour brew may lose customers for weeks. Marjorie scrubs the vat with hot water and lye soap. She scolds her daughter for leaving the window open near the mash. Quiet tension hangs in the air. She begins again the next morning. When the grain runs short. Brewing failures are frustrating. Bread shortages, however, are terrifying. In poor harvest years, grain prices spike. The manor mill may raise its toll. Barley, once plentiful, must be stretched. Rye is coarser, more bitter, and more prone to ergot, a toxic fungus that can cause hallucinations, sickness, and death. But when that's all that's left, it's used. Maud begins mixing her flour with legume meal, ground peas or beans. The bread becomes dense, greenish, and hard. Still, it is food. In the worst times, she bakes maslin, a mix of whatever grain is left. Some loaves are bulked with ground acorns, boiled and leached to remove bitterness. Others are made from bran and chaff, barely holding together. This is no longer baking. This is survival by innovation. Substitutes and stretching. When both barley and wheat are scarce, medieval women relied on every trick they knew. Leftover bread was dried, then ground into crumbs to be added to new dough. Ale lees, the leftover sediment from brewing, were sometimes mixed into pottage. Boiled roots like parsnips or turnips were mashed and added to dough to bulk it. When eggs were scarce, ale acted as a leavening agent in cakes or quick breads. Even the ashes from the oven were reused. In some places, ash lye was added to dough for color and mild preservation. It gave the bread a smoky, alkaline flavor, not pleasant but filling. Marjorie never learned these methods from books. She learned from her mother, who learned from hers, and so on. Each household had its own recipes, tailored to the earth, the weather, the strain of grain, and the desperation of the moment. The cost of salt. Salt, too, could be a problem. Bread needed a small amount of salt for flavor, preservation, and to help regulate the yeast. But salt was expensive and taxed in many regions. When salt ran low, women had to choose carefully. Use it for meat preservation, for cheese brining, or for bread. Sometimes herbs and ashes replaced salt. Flatbreads were flavored with wild onions, garlic, or even bitter greens. These tricks did not replace the real thing, but they delayed ruin. The alewife in court. When shortages came, so did tensions. Marjorie is called to the manorial court one Thursday morning, not for a crime, but for complaint. A neighbor has accused her of watering down ale and charging too much. The local ale taster, a man with a heavy ladle and a keener sense of politics than palate, confirms the ale was weaker than usual. Marjorie explains the last batch failed. The barley was thin. The yeast had not risen properly. She had no choice. But rules are rules. She is fined 1 penny, not a ruinous sum, but a reminder that even women's domestic labor was monitored and regulated. Alewives walked a fine line. Too successful and they were suspected of greed. Too poor and they were blamed for bad products. Some were called scolds or witches, accused of cursing competitors or causing illness. Brewing was power, and power, even in a wooden tub, was dangerous. Teaching and sharing. Despite the challenges, Marjorie does not keep her knowledge to herself. She teaches her daughters to knead by hand, to feel when dough is too wet or too dry, to test oven temperature with a palm to the clay. She shows them how to judge ale by smell, not taste. Children are not permitted to sample the early brews, but they learn. The rhythms of brewing and baking are passed like songs, sung, mimicked, perfected through repetition. Neighbors help one another during hard seasons. If Marjorie loses a batch, another alewife might lend her malt. If a woman is sick in childbed, someone else will bake her loaves. This is not charity. It is interdependence, a network of domestic labor, kept alive by mutual memory. Candle after the fire dies. At the end of the day, after loaves are pulled from the oven and ale is strained into jugs, Marjorie sits by the hearth. Her hands ache, her back tightens, but she has fed 6 mouths. She has brewed 5 gallons of drinkable ale. Tomorrow she will bake again. She doesn't ask for thanks. The satisfaction is simple, nothing was wasted, and tonight no one is hungry. She will check her rising dough before sleeping. If it bubbles gently, all is well. Still, this cycle leaves a question. What happens to women like Marjorie when they grow too old to knead, lift, or stir? How were aging women who held so much domestic knowledge cared for, respected, or forgotten in a system where labor was the only currency? The oven is cold this morning. Marjorie wakes before dawn as she always has, but her body is slower now. Her fingers are stiff. Kneeling to stoke the hearth takes longer. The dough she mixed last night needs shaping, but she hesitates. Her hands don't listen as well as they once did. She is no longer the only baker in the household. Her daughter Joan, 15 summers old, has been learning the trade step by step. Joan can knead now. She can tend the oven. She has begun to taste the mash and judge the rising foam of ale. But she is still learning. Marjorie watches her, heart full of quiet pride and concern. What knowledge can be passed down before the hands that hold it fail? The place of the elder woman. In medieval rural life, aging was not retirement. There were no pensions, no savings. A woman like Marjorie, who had spent decades kneading dough and brewing ale, did not stop because she turned a certain age. She stopped because her body no longer allowed it. And even then she worked. Older women shifted into other roles, tending fires when younger hands shaped dough, caring for children while others brewed, passing on recipes, methods, and warnings from memory. Some became midwives, others cared for the sick. Their value transitioned from production to preservation, not of goods, but of knowledge. Marjorie is now one of these women. Knowledge unwritten. Marjorie has never held a book. She cannot read. She has no recipe scrolls, no ledgers. Her knowledge lives in routine, muscle, and voice. She teaches by doing, by narrating as her hands work. The dough must not feel wet but not dry either, like your cheek after washing. When the ale turns, it smells like wet straw, not bread. Never bake when the wind comes from the east, it ruins the rise. These sayings are more than folk wisdom. They are practical systems, honed by centuries of observation. They keep the household fed. They are as essential as the oven itself. The vanishing worker. Yet despite her decades of labor, Marjorie will leave little trace. The records that survive the manorial rolls, the parish tithes, the tax lists may mention her only once, perhaps as Marjorie, fined for weak ale, or widow of Thomas the Cooper. Her bread and ale were recorded only in their absence when prices were too high, or when quality was questioned. The steady rhythm of her daily work, thousands of loaves, hundreds of gallons of ale, was not seen as history. It was survival. Even neighbors may forget in time. Once Joan takes over the oven, once others brew better or sell more, Marjorie's name may fade, but her craft remains. It is baked into the way Joan folds her dough. It bubbles in the wort she stirs. It lingers in the household like the scent of warm bread and boiled mash, comforting, essential, and unspoken. Care and community in old age. What happens when an alewife like Marjorie can no longer lift a pot or stir the mash? In the best cases, she remains in her family home, cared for by children or kin. Her labor, though unpaid, was repaid through obligation and love. She becomes a source of stories, a quiet advisor, a keeper of household rhythms. In other cases, the aging woman becomes vulnerable. If widowed without children, she may rely on the alms of the church or take up a place as a domestic helper in another household. The parish may provide bread or grain. Neighbors may bring food, but there are no guarantees. In rare moments, her brewing knowledge may earn her a place as a paid ale taster or brew supervisor, particularly in larger towns. But this is uncommon. For most, memory is the pension that others remember her contributions and act accordingly. Burial and the final offering. When Marjorie dies, perhaps in her sleep, perhaps during winter when the oven is quiet, there will be no grand marker. Her body may be wrapped in linen, placed in the churchyard, and buried with a priest's prayer. If her family can afford it, bread and ale will be given to the poor in her memory, a gesture of thanksgiving for a life spent feeding others. No one will mention how many loaves she baked. No one will count the gallons of ale she brewed. But for years after, neighbors will recall her crusty loaves, her mild brew, and her willingness to share grain when others had none. Joan, now grown and baking on her own, will tell her own daughter, Your grandmother could make a loaf rise even when the wind was wrong. And so her legacy endures not in ink, but in flour, yeast, and care. From the hearth of one woman came the meals of many. Her labor quiet, repetitive, unrecorded held her community together one loaf, one cup, one season at a time. But while women like Marjorie kept the village fed, others negotiated with lords, managed the books of monastic kitchens, or faced the tax collectors when their household couldn't meet its quota. What happened when the feudal system tightened its grip and peasants had to balance survival with taxation? Story 5. The tax collector comes to town, surviving the manor's demands. The village wakes with a different kind of tension today. The usual morning rituals, the crackle of the hearth, the slow simmer of pottage, the sounds of geese and sheep are all subdued. There is no joy in the children's voices. The adults speak in short sentences. The tax collector is coming. No one knows exactly when he will arrive. Perhaps after Mass, perhaps closer to dusk. But all know he will come, and he will come with a ledger, a list, and an expectation. For Hugh and Edith, now older than they once were, with their eldest son nearly a man, this is not their first encounter with the manor's agents. But it never becomes easier. Feudal dues are a fact of life, as regular as the seasons, but their timing always feels sharp. Today, it is not about law, but about obligation, and those obligations are layered, silent, and deep. The manor system, ownership without control. To understand the tension, you must first understand the structure. Most villages in 13th century England and across much of Europe exist within a manorial system. The land the peasants till the fields, meadows, and woodlots is not theirs in a legal sense. It is held from the lord, in exchange for labor, dues, and service. There are layers of tenancy. Villeins like Hugh owe regular labor on the lord's land and cannot leave without permission. Cotters or bordars hold smaller plots and may owe less labor but are often poorer. Freemen owe fewer dues but may still pay rent. What unites them all is that their rights to land come with obligations, and those obligations are enforced by the manor court and collected by the reeve or steward. The many forms of taxation. What we call taxes in this context are a tangle of payments, each with its own name and logic. Labor service. Hugh must spend several days each week working the lord's domain fields, plowing, planting, weeding before tending his own. This is year-round, except on holy days. Rent in kind payments, not in money but in goods, eggs, chickens, firewood, or produce. Edith has already set aside 6 eggs and a measure of barley, hoping it will be enough. Tithes, a tenth of the household's produce, is owed to the church, not the Lord. It goes to the local parish priest, but it is felt just as keenly. Tallage, an arbitrary cash payment demanded by the Lord, often during times of war or need. This is unpredictable and resented. Harriet, a death duty. When Hugh dies, the Lord will claim his best beast or tool before his land can pass to his son. Merchant, a fee paid when a daughter marries. Essentially, the family must compensate the Lord for losing a laborer. Fines and fees for baking in a private oven, brewing ale for sale, grinding grain anywhere but the Lord's mill, which charges a multure or milling fee. These are not all collected at once, but their accumulation defines the limits of peasant life. The collector's arrival. The steward rides into town by mid-morning, accompanied by a reeve, a local villager appointed to enforce obligations. His saddle is dusty, his tunic bears the manor's colors. Behind him rides a clerk with a roll of parchment, ink-stained fingers, and an eye for detail. The village gathers reluctantly near the manor barn. The steward begins reading names. Hugh steps forward when called. He bows, not deeply but respectfully. The steward does not look up. You owe 2 hens and 1 day's carting service. Have you the hens? Edith presents them. Hugh confirms he's available to transport timber next week. His name is scratched from the list. Others are not so lucky. One man pleads that his crop failed. The steward nods, then assigns double labor in lieu of payment. Another family, having just buried their eldest son, is told they still owe his labor for the week. The land does not rest, the steward says. No one protests. To argue is to invite court summons, and the court always sides with the Lord. Injustice, custom, and acceptance. Is this fair? To the villagers, fairness is less important than custom. What was done last year should be done this year. The system is brutal but stable. It changes slowly, if at all. If the steward demands something outside of custom, the village may resist quietly, collectively. There may be murmured protests, appeals to the priest, or refusals en masse, but this is rare and dangerous. In this world, survival means compliance, and resistance means risk. The weight of the list. After the collection, the steward and reeve retire to the manor house. The list is updated. Names are marked, debts noted. The villagers disperse. Some smile in relief, others mutter. The hens given are not replaceable. The extra day of labor will cost someone time in their own fields, but the list is finished for now. Edith returns home and counts the eggs left. Not many. She will need to barter or bake more quickly. Hugh sharpens a hoe. His son asks what a tallage is. Hugh changes the subject. These interactions do not end in battle nor rebellion. They end in adjustment: a few fewer meals, a day delayed in planting, a skipped church offering. The tax has been paid, but the cost will linger. Still, the balance is delicate. What happens when a village cannot pay when harvests fail, or livestock die, or a lord demands more than custom allows? How did families and whole communities respond to impossible burdens? The first sign is whispered: the hens are gone. A neighbor, normally quiet and careful, tells Edith what she already fears. Several households, her own among them, have nothing left to give. The barley yield was poor. The piglet died during a frost. The hen coop was raided by a fox or a thief. No one saw. Still, the steward's men will come again, and they will expect payment. The ledger does not know famine. It does not list illness or accidents. It records only what is owed. The failing harvest. The previous summer had been unkind. Too much rain or not enough. The grain mildewed. Mold crept through the stored flour and rats took their share. By harvest, Hugh's yield was half what it had been the year before. The family barely filled their granary bins. Even so, obligations remained the same. The manor steward, likely appointed by an absentee noble, rarely altered demands based on circumstance. The lord's estate required consistent output, for his own consumption, for trade, and for taxes owed to his liege lord. The villagers, in effect, were the foundation of a debt pyramid. If the base weakened, everyone above it squeezed harder. Making up the difference. There were a few limited ways to meet demands when food or animals failed. 1. Labor substitution. Instead of providing hens, Hugh agrees to an additional 3 days of carting firewood from the Lord's forest. This will mean less time in his own field and may delay planting, costing next season's crop, but it is accepted. 2. Bartering goods. Edith trades a woolen shawl made from her own spun thread to a better-off neighbor in exchange for 2 hens. One is given to the steward. The other will lay eggs if the foxes stay away. The shawl had been a gift for her daughter's wedding. The wedding will wait. 3. Borrowing against future harvests. This is the most dangerous. Some villagers borrow seed, grain, or livestock from the manor, but this is no gift. It comes with interest, often repaid as double labor during harvest, or a promise to serve as a bonded worker for a year. Such deals are usually spoken aloud at the manor court and entered into the steward's roll. There is no escape once agreed. The manor court, not justice but memory. The manorial court, often held in a small hall or barn, is both a meeting place and a tool of control. Villagers come here not to seek justice as we know it, but to affirm what custom and record dictate. The reeve calls the names, disputes are aired, fines are levied. On this particular day, 3 families are formally recorded as being in arrears. That is, they have not fulfilled their dues. The steward warns them, the debt will remain and next season's labor must double. Hugh and Edith are not on the list, but only just. Their negotiated labor days and borrowed hen have spared them for now. Later in private, a neighbor confides that he will not make it through the winter. His tools are worn, his field is overgrown, his only ox died and without it plowing is impossible. He considers leaving. But leaving the manor without permission is illegal. For villeins bound to the land, departure is a kind of theft. If caught, he could be fined, imprisoned, or worse. Collective action, rare but not impossible. Occasionally, when demands grow too heavy, villagers act together. Not in rebellion, rebellion is rare and dangerous, but in subtle solidarity. Refusing to pay until after the harvest. Presenting their hardships collectively at court. Withholding a portion of labor in protest. These are calculated risks. A lenient steward may accept them. A strict one may crack down, seizing grain or tools or assigning punishments like amercements, heavy fines. Hugh remembers a time, years ago, when several families together refused to pay an unexpected tallage. The steward relented, but only after the parish priest intervened. Edith considers asking the priest again now. He may help, or he may remind them that their duty to the Lord reflects their duty to God. Who bears the burden? Interestingly, women often absorb these pressures. When a family falls short, it is women's food stores that are scraped bare. It is women's chickens, spun wool, or cheese that are offered first. It is women who barter, beg, or negotiate quietly behind closed doors. Edith, like many wives and mothers, acts as the unofficial accountant of the household, knowing not only what is owed, but what can be spared. She hides coins in a pot, flour in a cloth bundle, eggs under straw. She counts not in shillings, but in meals, days, and futures. What happens when a family fails? If a household cannot pay and cannot make it up with labor or barter, the consequences are sharp. Fields may be confiscated. Tools may be seized. A family might be demoted from villein to cotter, fewer rights, smaller land, more dependency. In worse cases, they may become landless laborers, working for others, sleeping on dirt floors, living from day to day. Some run away to towns or distant manors. Some find temporary refuge in monasteries or with relatives. A few enter service in noble households, exchanging their freedom for food and shelter. It is not often death that ends a peasant's independence. It is debt. Still, life goes on. After the steward leaves, the village exhales. Debts are noted. The next day's tasks resume. The plowshare must still be sharpened. The seed must still go into the ground. The tax was paid, if only barely. But how did these fragile systems begin to shift? What changes came when famine struck not one household, but the entire region? How did manor life adapt or fail when catastrophe arrived? The year is 1316. It has rained for weeks. The barley sprouts rot in the ground. The wheat heads blacken before they form. Hay molds in the lofts. Streams overflow, flooding low fields. Roads wash out and grain wagons sink into mud. By now, word has spread from other villages. The harvest has failed everywhere. This is no ordinary bad season. This is the Great Famine, and the manorial system, already brittle under the weight of endless dues and obligations, is about to crack. The Great Famine, 1315–1317, a breaking point. Across northern Europe, a series of unusually wet summers leads to agricultural failure on a vast scale. Crops drown, Livestock die from disease. Salted meat rots in cellars. People begin eating seed grain. By the second year, starvation becomes visible. Hugh and Edith, now older than most, know hunger. They have seen lean years, but this is different. There are no extra hens to offer, no barley to barter. Even the village miller has stopped grinding his wheel frozen, his grain stores bare. The steward has not visited in days. Perhaps he too is struggling. What happens to tax in famine? In theory, dues do not disappear. The manor still expects labor and payments, but in practice, the system slows, buckles, and begins to bend. Labor quotas are reduced, but not forgiven. Rents are deferred, but not canceled. Extraordinary levies like tallage are suspended in some manors, but increased in others, depending on the greed or desperation of the lord. In Hugh's village, the steward returns in late summer with a shortened roll. "Pay what you can," he says. "The rest will be accounted for." This sounds merciful, but the unspoken truth is that all deferred dues become future debt. Next year's harvest must pay for 2 or 3. If next year fails, as it does again in 1317, the debt becomes unpayable. Survival without the system. During the worst months, the villagers begin to act outside the manor's reach. They trade directly, neighbor to neighbor, often in secrecy. Edith barters linen thread for dried peas. Hugh offers to repair a neighbor's roof in exchange for half a sack of rye. Joan, now married, sends preserved roots from her husband's manor. The church helps where it can, though even the priests are hungry. Almsgiving increases, but not enough. Monasteries open their stores, but only to those with connections. The parish graveyard begins to fill not with plague victims, that comes later, but with the slow dead, the old, the weak, the newborn. Still no one rebels, they endure. The manor falters. Not only peasants suffer, lords too feel the strain. With no crops to sell, no rents to collect, and no surplus to trade, many manors fall into debt. Some begin to sell off rights, leasing out land for fixed rent instead of labor service. This will later become copyhold tenure, a sign of changing times. Others reduce enforcement, the court roll thins. The steward, when he arrives, speaks more softly. "Stay on the land," he says, "do what you can." Manorial rigidity, long the law of the land, is giving way to pragmatism. The quiet reckoning. When the rain finally stops in 1318, the ground takes weeks to dry. The first successful barley sprigs feel like miracles. But the village is changed. Fewer mouths, fewer debts collected, fewer animals. The manor has lost income. The people have lost faith. Edith has buried a grandson. Hugh no longer plows. He tends chickens now, quietly, near the house. He still remembers the steward's visit, how the man's boots squelched in the mud, how his pen scratched fewer names than before. That ledger, once a symbol of power, had begun to lose its weight. A shift in custom. In the years that follow the famine, custom begins to bend. Some manors convert labor dues into fixed rents. Others allow peasants to buy out their obligations, turning villeins into tenants. The rise of money rents gives villagers more autonomy if they can find coin. And over time, lords depend less on peasant labor and more on market forces. None of this happens overnight, but the Great Famine cracks the certainty of the old system. The steward still visits, the court still meets, but now the peasants negotiate. They ask for mercy, and sometimes they receive it. The fear is not gone, but it is tempered by memory of a time when even the ledger could not stop the rain. The wisdom left behind. In the end, survival during these times did not come from rebellion or revolt, but from resourcefulness, community, and the unspoken labor of those who bent without breaking. The taxes returned, the debts remained, but so did Hugh and Edith. They lived not by defiance, but by adjustment, bartering thread, labor, tools, and time. When the system strained, they didn't escape it. They endured it. They passed that endurance on to their children. And when the next steward arrived, years later with a fresh roll and a thinner voice, Edith greeted him with the same short bow. She had nothing left to fear. Even as the medieval manor weakened and taxes began to change, the demands on rural life remained. But what of those who aged and ailed within this system? What care existed for the elderly, the disabled, or the injured in a world where work was survival? Story 6. Health, Aging, and the Medieval Diet. Hugh is old now. He no longer plows the field. His hands, once calloused and strong, tremble when tying a sack or lifting a bucket. His back hunches forward not from injury, but from years of repetition, lifting, planting, kneading, bending, surviving. He has lived through famine, fevers, deaths, and weddings. And still he wakes, still he tends the chickens, still he moves slowly across the packed earth floor of his cottage. But he does not smile as much, and he chews with difficulty, because Hugh, like so many of his generation, is now toothless. The diet that wears you down, the food that once sustained Hugh, is the same food that wears him down. The medieval peasant diet is heavy in coarse bread, porridge, beans, stewed vegetables, and occasionally salted meat. Rarely is it tender. Bread is made with stone-ground flour, which inevitably includes traces of grit and stone dust. Over decades, these tiny particles wear down tooth enamel, leading to exposed roots, infections, and tooth loss. There is no dental care, not as we understand it. Toothache is treated with herbs, poultices, and sometimes prayer. If a tooth becomes too painful, it may be pulled by force using iron tongs or by a local man with a steady hand. An uncleaned wound might lead to infection, even death. By his 60s, an advanced age for a peasant, Hugh can chew only the softest foods. Edith cooks more pottage than before. She mashes beans, boils leeks, and slices bread into thin pieces to soak in broth. What did they eat? Let's look at a typical daily meal for a medieval peasant elder. Morning, thin ale, porridge made from oats or barley, maybe flavored with onions or a bit of stale cheese. Midday, pottage, thick soup with cabbage, turnip, maybe lentils. If meat is available, it's likely salted and stewed to tenderness. Evening, soaked bread, a bit of ale or milk, maybe mashed peas. There is no sugar, no processed food, no refrigeration. The diet is simple, filling, and repetitive. Vitamins are limited, and diseases of deficiency like scurvy can appear in hard years. Yet despite its limitations, the diet is sustaining. It keeps bodies working, just not always comfortably. What aging looks like in the village. Hugh isn't the only elder. In every village, there are a handful of men and women who outlive the average. Life expectancy is skewed by high infant mortality if you survive childhood and childbirth. Reaching 50 or 60 is not unheard of. But aging is not gentle. Without proper medicine, glasses, dental care, or rest, the body wears down quickly. Common signs of aging: tooth loss and gum disease, arthritis, especially in the hands and knees, chronic back pain, poor eyesight, hearing loss, incontinence, often hidden but known, hernia, swollen joints, and skin conditions. There are no retirement homes, no doctors in villages. Care comes from family, neighbors, and sometimes the church. Rest but not retirement. Hugh does not work in the fields, but he still works. He feeds chickens, sharpens tools, teaches his grandson how to tie bundles, repairs wooden buckets with pitch and twine, helps judge when the barley is ready to thresh. He rests more often, takes shorter steps, sleeps longer, but his presence is part of the household's balance. He is not idle, and he is not useless. The rhythm of aging is slower, not still. Illness and the unseen. Not all aging is visible. Some elder villagers suffer from fevers that return each winter, lung ailments worsened by years of smoke from fire-heated homes, digestive issues from spoiled or coarse food, depression though it has no name, confusion and memory loss, seen as signs of spiritual unease or second childhood. Mental decline is poorly understood. An older villager who forgets things or behaves strangely is treated with caution, not cruelty but certainly mistrust. Sometimes such a person is sent to live with the church. Other times they are simply kept home, watched quietly, cared for until death. There is no shame in being old, but there is isolation. Care without comfort. Edith, herself aging, does what she can for Hugh. She mends his cloak. She feeds him soft bread. On cold nights she tucks an extra woolen blanket over him, stitched from rags and scraps. If he becomes ill, she will make a garlic poultice for his chest, or steep thyme and honey for his throat. If he worsens, she will call the priest not for healing, but for absolution. Sometimes the younger women come to sit with Hugh when he tells stories, or mumbles prayers, or simply sleeps. These acts of quiet dignity are their own kind of medicine. But what of those elders without family, without land, without children? What role did the church or community play in their care? And how were these individuals remembered or forgotten when their labor finally ceased? The sun rises on a crisp spring morning, and no one sees Elspeth leave her cottage. She is older than Hugh, older than anyone else in the village, perhaps. A widow with no children, no surviving siblings, no land of her own. Her hands once spun wool for the entire parish. Her baked onions at Candlemas were once the talk of the green. Now she is remembered mostly by the length of her silences. She still moves about just barely. She still feeds her one chicken, still combs her hair with a bone comb handed down from a time she no longer clearly recalls. But the rhythm of life, once so full of purpose, now runs quieter. Her food stores are nearly gone. And no tax collector will come for her. She owes nothing now because she has nothing. The unlanded, the unmoored. In every village, there are those who do not belong to a household, at least not anymore. They are widows or widowers, the unmarried or childless, the disabled, the poor or dispossessed, those who once served but were dismissed, orphans and the abandoned. Without family to rely on, these individuals occupy a different space in the community, one marked by dependency, vulnerability, and often pity. The church and the poor. In theory, Christian charity is a pillar of medieval life. Christ commands it. Bishops preach it. Every Sunday, villagers hear readings about the least among you. In practice, care for the old and poor is limited by means, not intention. The church helps in a few ways. Almsgiving. Wealthier villagers or lords give coin, grain, or bread to the poor at holy festivals, funerals, or weddings. Dole bread. Some churches maintain a poor box or distribute bread after Mass, especially during Lent or Advent. Hospitaller orders. In towns, religious institutions might run almshouses or hospices, offering shelter to the aged or infirm. Parish obligation. The parish priest may intercede, asking families to take in an elder or provide basic aid. But in rural villages, there is often no institution, only custom and conscience. Feeding the forgotten. Villagers may take turns feeding the elderly poor, a bowl of pottage here, a crust of bread there. A young boy may be sent to carry firewood. A widow might be invited to sit near another family's hearth during winter. This is not formal care. There are no lists, no schedules. It is neighborly habit, rooted in shared memory and the quiet knowledge that all will age. But these gestures depend on goodwill. If harvests fail, or tempers rise, or memories fade, the old may be forgotten. Elspeth has seen this. She remembers an old man who died of cold in the sheep shed. No one noticed for 2 days. The final years. As strength fades, the elderly spend more time sitting, resting, watching. They are not idle, just still. They mumble prayers for the dead, whisper weather signs to children, offer advice unasked but often correct, sit in the sun, warming bones, tell stories of wars, of lords long dead, of harvests never matched again. Their minds may be sharp or wandering, their eyes may see or not, but they are still present. The village does not rush them. It simply moves around them like water around a stone. Legacy without ledger. Those without children leave no heirs. But they still leave legacy. A stitching pattern passed to a niece. A method for storing onions that survives 3 more generations. A recipe remembered only during feast days. A blessing spoken over bread long after the speaker is gone. None of this is written, but none of it is lost. The end without ceremony. When Elspeth finally dies quietly, wrapped in a linen sheet beneath her woolen shawl, there is no inheritance, no will, no dowry chest to divide. Her cottage is swept. Her chicken is caught by a neighbor. She is buried in the parish yard, beside her husband, beneath a wooden cross that will rot in 10 years' time. No chronicle records her name. But when her youngest neighbor stirs a pot of pottage and adds wild thyme, she will say, "Elspeth told me it keeps the stomach calm." And someone will nod, and so she remains. So much of aging in the medieval world is born not by systems, but by human memory, unofficial, uneven, but deeply rooted. But how did sickness and injury, sudden, not slow, change a family's ability to survive? What happened when a laborer broke his leg or a mother took ill? What care, if any, existed for those struck down before their time? It happens quickly. A cart axle cracks, a wheel collapses. Hugh's middle son Walter tries to brace the load, but the weight falls across his shin. The bone snaps cleanly. He cries out, collapses in the field, and for a long while no one speaks. This is not a battlefield. There are no surgeons, no tourniquets soaked in wine. Only a twisted leg, a half-loaded cart, and the gathering realization that Walter may never walk the same way again. In a world where every family member's labor is necessary, illness and injury are not just bodily trials, they are economic, social, and spiritual events. The reality of injury. Injury is common in medieval life. A misstep while plowing, a fall from a ladder while thatching, a burn from the oven, a twisted ankle in the field. There are no hospitals in villages. The closest thing to care is the cunning woman, the wise man, or the priest. For broken limbs, treatment involves immobilizing the injury with splints, often wooden slats wrapped with linen, applying herbal compresses to reduce swelling, comfrey, elderflower, or wormwood, saying prayers, often invoking saints like St. Apollonia for pain or St. Roch for healing. There is no anesthesia, no antiseptics. Infections may fester, bones may set poorly or not at all. Walter lies still for days, then weeks. He is young, and so he heals, but his leg is crooked now. He cannot lift the plow. When illness comes, injury is visible, illness is not. Fevers, coughs, stomach sickness, wasting, these arrive without cause or pattern. Some believe they are punishment for sin. Others blame bad air or astrological imbalance. Care falls to the household. Edith soaks cloths in vinegar to cool Walter's fever. She boils willow bark for pain. She steeps nettle and garlic to strengthen his blood. The local priest is called to pray, not to heal, but to prepare his soul, just in case. There is fear but not panic. Illness is as common as rain. What matters is whether the body rallies. If it does not, the family adjusts. The cost of care. For every day Walter cannot work, someone else must take his place. Joan steps in hoeing, carrying, thrashing. Her husband helps too, though he has his own fields. But this robs other duties less spinning gets done. Meals are simpler. The household becomes thinner, more strained. If the illness is long, debts accumulate. The steward does not waive dues for injury. The tax ledger has no column for broken leg. They manage barely, but one more illness, one more failure would tip them over. This is the fragile math of survival. Communal support and limits. In close-knit villages, aid is offered but not endlessly. A neighbor might drop off boiled grain or soft bread, help with a plowing turn, share herbs or ointments. But each family has its own limits. If too many are sick at once, the whole community begins to fray. In some cases, the church may help, distributing alms from wealthier patrons, offering beds in monastic houses for the terminally ill if space allows, praying over the sick in Mass. But no institution guarantees care, and few are equipped for the chronically ill. The weight of guilt. There is another layer, spiritual consequence. Illness is often seen as a sign not just of the body's weakness, but of the soul. People wonder, has Walter sinned? Is the family cursed? Was the field consecrated properly? Were dues paid? The priest offers absolution. The family lights a candle to St. Leonard, patron of prisoners and the sick. Edith makes a small offering of cheese at the altar. They whisper about making a pilgrimage, perhaps to a shrine with healing water. But travel is dangerous, and Walter cannot walk. Life after injury. When Walter recovers, he walks with a limp. He can no longer lift loads or run, but he learns to tend the garden, muck out stalls, help spin wool, watch the children while others work. He becomes part of the household economy again, just not in the way once expected. His role shifts, his dignity does not disappear. In time, he becomes a keeper of memory. He tells stories, teaches skills, mends tools, and reminds others to watch the wheels of the cart. Adaptation as survival. There is no miracle in this story, no full recovery, no rebellion, just adjustment. The medieval household is resilient not because it avoids hardship, but because it absorbs it, adapts, and continues. Work is shared, tasks are reshuffled, pottage is thinned, songs are shortened, sleep is broken, but the home endures. And in time, so does Walter.